Welcome back to A Year of Final Fantasy, and today we're going to send off Siren with a look at Final Fantasy II, one of the least talked about main Final Fantasy games. Okay, so let's address the elephant in the room, and this is not the last time you're going to hear about this. So, many of you know this, but for those that don't, let me explain. Final Fantasy II originally came out in the States on November 23rd, 1991. Or at least it kind of did. If you were around back then and played Final Fantasy II, you probably had it for the Super Nintendo, and you were treated with this amazing story of a Dark Knight redemption, Kain, this awesome anti-hero, stories of family, betrayal, and sacrifice. The thing is, though, that's actually not in Final Fantasy II. None of it, really. At least, not the Final Fantasy II proper. Because you see, the actual game was never even released in the States for several years. Due to the timing and translations and the lifespans of systems back then, Final Fantasy I came out in the United States before the Super Nintendo released, and at that point the majority of gamers largely moved on to the new system. Final Fantasy II and III were just not released on the NES here in the States at all until the PlayStation 1 actually came around. So Final Fantasy IV, which was on the Super Famicom in Japan, actually came over as Final Fantasy II, which released on the Super Nintendo, which was to reduce confusion, but it kind of didn't work because now Final Fantasy II has been released in the States, so whenever we're talking about Final Fantasy II, and you'll see later Final Fantasy III, we kind of have to address this, and it's just a really big headache all around. So just keep in mind that this game that I'm talking about was eventually released in the States, but this is the original Final Fantasy II for the Nintendo Entertainment System, and originally the Famicom. So after coming out with what was an amazing game of Final Fantasy I, what does Final Fantasy II actually bring to the franchise? Well, one of the strangest things, at least at the time, is that Final Fantasy II actually doesn't really have anything to do with Final Fantasy I at all. People would expect a continuation of the story, but that's just not the case in this instance. In the terms of story and world building, it's just completely 100% different. And that being said, the mechanics of the game are also very, very different as well. So I'll get to the story elements in a little bit, but first let's go ahead and take a look at the mechanics of the game. It should be noted that the game was designed by Akitoshi Kawazu, not Hironobu Sakaguchi, although Sakaguchi still led the game and development team. It's just that the design, the mechanical aspects of the game was not designed by him. So that is one reason for the rather large departure of the battle system mechanics in this game. After Final Fantasy II, it's good to note that Akitoshi went to work on another popular franchise, maybe not as popular today, but it's known as the Saga series, which uses similar mechanics, obviously improved upon, but that is something that makes Final Fantasy II a bit of an oddity with the rest of the series. I'd also like to note that Final Fantasy II was the first game to receive a novelization based on the story, and if you haven't seen it yet, we've actually covered that in our last episode of the Final Fantasy novelization, so check that out. Like I said, the most obvious change to the mechanics are the battle system and the leveling system. Battles now take place on a single screen without that archaic box that split up the enemies versus the party. Now they're just all on one single playing field, which is how the battle system is for the rest of the series. Also, for the first time, magic points, or MP, are introduced, so they get rid of that Vancian casting system that we had in Final Fantasy I. MP obviously being the standard for much of the series onward, except for certain games like Final Fantasy VIII. This was also the first game to introduce the front and back row mechanics. Now, Final Fantasy I didn't have this, but when characters are in the back row, they're basically immune to taking damage from physical hits and things like that. Now, if your entire front row was killed, you could get hit with physical attacks on the back row, so that applies to both your characters and enemy characters. Much of that is standard through much of the series, but the biggest change is how the character progression works, and this is the only game that really takes this kind of approach to it. Today, looking back on the system, it may seem like such a drastic change, or even far ahead of its time. The battle system is seemingly taken right from Elder Scrolls or maybe other Western RPGs at the time, and the fact that there are no real levels to speak of. So instead, as characters fight, they actually naturally improve upon what they use. For example, if you use magic, you're going to increase your magic power and MP. If you use particular types of weapons like swords, you'll get better at those. And whenever you get hit, you'll get more HP because you seemingly get more hardy, I guess. This system was incredibly ambitious, but it did introduce ways to exploit the system. So while it sounds amazing on paper, and I'd still defend it to naysayers, there are no doubt implementation issues with it. Other than that, there is one rather large overlooked and possibly unintended effect of this type of leveling system. Since there are no levels, it's much harder to keep track of progression and how to gauge how powerful an enemy should be at any given time. So as you wander around on the world map, even at the very beginning of the game, you can go too far in one direction and you can encounter incredibly tough enemies, and basically you will get an instant party wipe because they'll kill you before you have any time to escape. I suspect this is why similar games later on use a scaling system to match enemies to what you can handle. So whenever you play the game, those are immediately the biggest mechanical changes that you'll see. One other change comes through general gameplay. Again, this seems to be taking a page from the Western RPGs and how they tried to incorporate a tabletop feeling to the game. And what I'm referring to is that as you talk with townsfolk, you can actually learn key phrases, and with those phrases you can go and talk to other people and get more information with them, thus progressing the story. I personally rather like this mechanic, and it reminds me of the days of wasting hours on these text adventures. So that's all I'll say about the new mechanics in this game. If it sounds interesting, definitely try it out for yourself. You may like it. Now, all of that being said, there's no denying that there is a huge impact of the story on the franchise. As I said before, this game is completely different from its predecessor, and this is significant because this game basically sets in stone what the feeling of the Final Fantasy franchise will be from a narrative perspective, more so than Final Fantasy I. So what exactly is different? Well, many of the things that we will associate with Final Fantasy really begin with this game. Although in Final Fantasy I you have the crystals and jobs and everything, in this game we get the really big, what you might consider iconic things about the franchise, such as chocobos. We have the Cid character, dragoons, and the associated Highwind family name. You have these evil empires built on world domination and the small rebellion fact. There are iconic story-centric airships, and possibly most important is that the characters are no longer nameless heroes. Our first named hero of the franchise comes from this game, and his name is Firion, and I personally enjoy the look of him very much. By today's standards, these characters don't have a really large, impactful story associated with them, say, compared to Cloud or Squall or somebody, but they do have a story and they are tied to this world, and that is vastly different than anything that we saw from Final Fantasy I. There are some other firsts as well. I'll just mention a few of them. We have the familiar recurring name of Mysidia. We also get the mention of Ultima as the ultimate magic, and the Ultima weapon, which is a super boss, which we'll see again recurring throughout the series. And other mentions like Leviathan, we see later come back as a summon. We see things that are just completely entrenched in Final Fantasy lore of the franchise really get their start here. But going back to this more narrative aspect, the game starts off with a scene of the Empire destroying the main character's town, and immediately it throws you into an unwinnable battle. This was crazy at the time, and it really portrayed how weak you were and how strong the Empire was. This is also the beginning of the infamous cutscenes that the franchise has been known for. Another thing of note is that you can actually battle in this game as you progress through with less than 4 party members. Now that may not seem like a lot or anything significant, but it is the first game in the franchise to do this, so I think it is worth a shout out. And you'll get different characters that will join and then leave throughout the game. It's just something we did not see in Final Fantasy I at all. The music, as it was in Final Fantasy I, is incredibly excellent here, composed by Uematsu. Some of the best songs in the series appear in this game, one of which you've been hearing all throughout this entire month. And so as we draw to the end of this month of Siren and Final Fantasy II, I'd just like to say that this game, in my opinion, is one of the most underrated games in the series, and it's by far the least talked about game. I don't think anyone would debate on that. So I urge you to at least try the game. Much much of the talk online has been negative, but I do think the game is better than what people are giving it credit for. And I'm fully aware that I see these games usually in a better light than others, but I guess, I don't know, I have an aspect about me that tries to look for the good in games rather than overemphasizing the negative, though I don't think that you should disregard the negative at all. Final Fantasy II has been re-released many times in the US, despite having to wait for it until the PlayStation came out. Well, actually, to be fair, a dedicated group of people did create a fan translation in the early 90s for the ROMs, but for commercial purposes and stuff like that, that's all I'll mention of that, but it is worth mentioning that we did want the game when it was released. Anyway, on the more official side of things, you can find Final Fantasy II in the Final Fantasy Origin Collection for PlayStation 1, where it was originally debuted in the States. You can get it on the Dawn of Souls Collection for Game Boy Advance, which actually supports a post-game dungeon, and you can find it on the iOS and PlayStation Portable systems. In my opinion, the best way to play this game is going to be on the PlayStation Portable. You'll also get a pretty decent experience with the iOS ports. So looking back on the month of Siren, I've hoped you at least learned a few things and maybe have sparked your interest in a game you may have originally dismissed. We've talked about so much this month, and I'm happy to have taken a good look at Final Fantasy II and acknowledged the much maligned game. You just don't hear about it a lot, which is sad. Final Fantasy II really is the stepping off point for the Final Fantasy franchise as a whole. As we send off Siren, we step into March with the month of Ramuh, the god of storms. This coming month will have much more cohesive structure than the previous months as we look at one of the largest side series of the franchise, Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles, ending with a look at an even more elusive game than Final Fantasy II, Final Fantasy III. So until next time, Crystal Warriors, keep on gaming.